So, we're going to be in Acts chapter 18. Our text today is a big section of text. It's 1 through 23. If you guys know me, I can usually teach for about 2 or 3 hours on like 6 words. So this is a big transition. But it's important because Paul's going to come to this city called Corinth. And when he gets there, he's going to use a different angle, a different style of how he shares the gospel with people than he did previously. And I think it's important that we kind of catch this, okay? He's just left Athens. Now, Athens, Greece, so we know that place. It's there today, right? And when he was in Athens back in Paul's day was known for their philosophies, their education. It was the number one hub in all of the Roman Empire back then for education. In fact, it went, Athens was number 1, then it was Tarsus of Cilicia was number 2, which is where Paul's from, and then number 3 was Alexandria of Egypt. These were the 3 main places where the universities were, the philosophers were. And so he's leaving Athens. The number would be like, in Oregon, it'd be like going down to Eugene and going down to, U of O. And that would be kind of like the hub of the university of our state. But this was the hub of the University of the Roman Empire. And so he leaves that place and he goes to this new place called Corinth. And I kind of want to talk about what is Corinth like? What did it look like? Is it similar to anything like today? Well, it is. If you were to take Corinth back in Paul's day and put it into any modern day city of today, it would be very similar, a little darker, but it'd be very similar to our Las Vegas today. What do I mean? Okay, Corinth was a city that didn't coin the phrase, but if they did, they would have said, "What happens in Corinth stays in Corinth," right? That's the kind of phrase that they would have had, which is what Vegas capitalized. Corinth was known as Sin City, which is something that they actually coined. Sin City, which is something that Vegas coined. So it's very similar to it's a high commerce place. There's a lot of different things going on. You can get married in a day, you can get divorced the next day, you can do all these things like you can in Vegas. And so Paul is going to go there. Now, when he writes, so he leaves Athens, he goes to Corinth. He's going to be there for a minute. He's going to be there for a couple years. And then he's going to leave, and then he's going to write letters to Corinth. And these are going to be response letters that he's going to write. But when he wrote 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, when he wrote 1 Corinthians after he had left, he said this, and I kind of want to start off with this even though we're in Acts. He said in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, he said, "And I, brethren, when I came to you, did not come with excellence of speech or of wisdom, declaring you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. And my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and power, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God." And as we think through this really quick, remember, Paul is coming to Corinth as he's leaving Athens, okay? So when he says, I'm coming to you as a broken man. And I want to gather the context here. I came to you as a broken man. I left Athens a broken man. Now, how do we know Paul is broken? Because it's in the Bible. This is the Q&A part, right? Yeah. We know that when Paul went on his second missionary journey, in his first missionary journey, he went to the region of Galatia and he planted 4 or 5 churches. On his second missionary journey, he visited those churches, he went through Asia Minor, and he ended up in Macedonia. Now, Macedonia is Europe. And in Macedonia, you have the churches of Philippi, you have the church of Berea, you have the church of Thessalonica. And so we know that he went to Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, and then he left Macedonia and he went down to Greece, to Achaia, which is Athens, and then Corinth, which is an island below. But when he was in Philippi, do you guys remember what happened in Philippi? He was unlawfully imprisoned. He was beaten with rods. He was thrown into prison, and then he was asked to leave. And so he goes to Thessalonica, and he starts to share the gospel there. And the people there got really angry with him, and he had to flee for his life at night. And so he flees and he goes to Berea. Now, Berea is a great, great place. Beautiful church there that he plants. But when the people of Thessalonica find out that Paul is there, they travel 100 miles, whatever it is, go to Berea, and he has to flee there by night, under the cover of night, because he's being persecuted. His life is being threatened. And so he gets to Athens, and he's just fled from all these places trying to kill him. And now he's come into Corinth, and he's a broken man. Paul's human. If you guys got beaten with rods, you'd be pretty, broken. You know? He's a human being. He's sharing his faith, and he's getting attacked. He moves to another place, he's getting attacked. He's sharing the all-inclusive gospel, he's getting attacked. So he came to Corinth, a broken man. Okay? He's broken. Now, Paul had his ministry in Athens for a little bit. You know, he went to the synagogues and he went to the marketplaces there, and he shared the gospel with some key people. And while he was in Athens, he had, when he left Berea, he went to Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, then he went down to Athens. When he left Berea, he left his team in Berea. He says, hey, Timothy and Silas, stay in Berea. I'm going to go down to Athens. I want you guys to finish the work here. Well, when he gets to Athens, he realizes, there's a big work here. This place is full of idols and religion and paganism. And so he sends for his boys, right? He says, Timothy and Silas, come back. So he sends messengers. They come to Athens, and then he's there for a while. He's ministering. And then he sends Timothy and Silas back to Macedonia, to Thessalonica, to Berea, to these different places while he is in Athens. And then he moves down to Corinth. And when he's in Corinth, Timothy and Silas are going to come back from Macedonia into Corinth. And so there's all this stuff going on, which Luke only mentions that he went from Athens to Corinth. And we know that he's been there a while, so it's a really big deal there. It's a lot of time there. Now, it's interesting because Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2, he says, "For I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." And there are many people, many scholars, so you know me, I do a lot of studying and I do a lot of reading. And when I'm looking at commentaries and what scholars write about the text, there's a lot of chewing out the meat, spitting out the bones. There's a lot of opinion in commentaries. You know, and I'm like, oh, that looks good, that's not good, that's good. But a lot of commentaries believe that the reason he's sharing Christ crucified here is because he did not do it in Athens. But we concluded last week that I don't think that was the case. I think Paul, when he was in Athens, he shared the gospel. He shared Jesus and the resurrection. In order to share the resurrection, you have to share the crucifixion. I mean, if someone's going to resurrect, they have to die. You can't talk about resurrection without death. And so I don't believe that, though many scholars would buy into that he didn't preach the gospel, that's why he didn't have fruit. I believe he had fruit, and he just shared the gospel a different way because it was a different audience. I wouldn't share the gospel the same way with someone from, say, the background of being a Catholic or Mormon or Jehovah's Witnesses, those who know the word, someone from maybe Islam, who have religious understandings. I would share the gospel different with them than I would with an atheist or an agnostic who don't even believe the Bible. I'm not going to go and use the Bible. The Bible says, because they don't believe it. And Paul is dealing with philosophers in Athens, and he's dealing with agnostics and pantheists, people with gods and everything, but they don't believe that God is knowable, and they don't believe in the scriptures. And so he uses and talks about the God of creation. And he changes his focus, but I think he shares the gospel. It's pretty thorough there. But he comes to Corinth here and he says, "For I determined not to know anything among you except Christ and him crucified." Now, he also says in this text that I came with you with weakness and fear. And I want us to kind of keep a mental note there because we're going to come back and address that at the end of this message. Because everywhere Paul goes, he suffers persecution. And again, Paul's human. There are going to be times, I mean, you guys have you ever been scared? Fearful? We get scared and fearful over things we can't see, you know? Paul's facing death threats and getting attacked and assaulted, and people are taking vows, we're going to see later on in the book of Acts, that we're not going to eat or drink until Paul's dead. I mean, that's something to be afraid of. You know, he's afraid. He comes to them in weakness and fear because everywhere he goes, there's a sense of persecution. And just because a person is bold and brave and is leading doesn't mean that person doesn't face fear. People get scared. We're all people, right? So a person who's strong isn't a person that doesn't have fear. A person who's strong is a person who faces their fear and goes, really seeks the Lord in the midst of their fear. And regardless of what their fear says, they obey the Lord in the midst of it. That's what a strong person is. Okay? So Paul goes on to say, he says, I was with you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. And my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom. Okay? I didn't come to you in elegance. Okay? In fact, we know that there's going to be an elegant preacher that's going to come named Apollos. And Apollos is written all through the book of Acts. He's introduced in our Acts 18 text in verse 24. It says, now a certain Jew named Apollos, born of Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures. So Apollos was eloquent. Paul wasn't. And you're like, hold on, Amy. Paul wasn't eloquent in his words? No. What Paul had is he was extremely knowledgeable. And the problem is, well, it's not a problem. Paul was a master with the scriptures, okay? But he wasn't the greatest preacher. He wasn't eloquent. In fact, when Paul writes 2 Corinthians, they were accusing him, saying, hey, listen, this guy's mighty in his pen, but when he comes to us, his speech is contemptible. It's like two different people. He says in 2 Corinthians 10:10, he says, this is what they were saying about Paul. He says, for his letters, they say, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence weak, and his speech contemptible. And we're like, how can this be? Well, it's very simple. We have his letters. We read his letters and we're like, wow, Paul is mighty and powerful. His theology is right on. But we never heard him preach. Okay? These guys heard him preach and heard his letters, and they're scratching their head and they're like, is this the same guy? His letters have so much authority, so much power. And then he comes in here and he's like, about that. So and it's contemptible. It gives me hope, actually. It gives me hope. Because we think of Paul as mighty, intellectual, eloquent. Because we read his letters. His letters are weighty and powerful. And maybe when Paul finally leaves Athens and he goes to Corinth, he has this sigh of relief that he can breathe. Because, think about it. He just left the philosophical capital of the Roman Empire. Do you know how difficult it is to win, let's say, those university professors or those scientists, how hard it is to win those who they just don't care. They use these big words and we're supposed to be intimidated by it, right? And it's so hard, but then you go to just a normal community of people who struggle in life, and it's like a sigh of relief because you don't have to use these big intellectual words, this big theological doctrine. You don't have to talk about sanctification and soteriology and eschatology. You can just say, hey, Jesus loves you. And you can bring it down to basics. It's so much easier for him. So I think he has a sigh of relief. Because the people in Corinth, remember, it's like going to Vegas. They didn't have it all together. Corinth was a city that was known for their immorality and their drunkenness. In fact, they had these arenas all throughout the Roman Empire, where they would do these plays. These theatrical plays, and they put on these masks, the angry or whatever, sad. And it was kind of like our modern day movies. We go to the movies and watch a play. They just didn't have the technology. And whenever they had a play and a character that was from Corinth came on, that character was always a drunkard. Always. So he's stumbling on stage and they go, oh, that's a Corinthian. Because that's what they were known for. Yeah, they lived in stereotypes back then too. And so when you go to Corinth, there's this there's a goddess that they worship. It's this goddess called Aphrodite. And Aphrodite is known as the goddess of love. Okay? Now it's recorded in secular history, not biblical history, secular history, that in Corinth, in the temple, they had over 1,000 female slaves who were the priestesses and the prostitutes in the temple for Aphrodite. So people would come to Corinth and they could hook up, and those priestesses would have sexual relations with them. They would pay, it's prostitution under the guise of worship. They were worshiping the goddess of love. Now, I have a couple of slides. I want to show actually quite a few. But here's slide 1. This is going to be the temple of this is in Corinth today. This is modern day Corinth. This would be the temple, the ruins left of the temple that's in Corinth. Okay, I have another slide here, slide number 2. And they're numbered on the bottom right corner, so you can see that. So this is Corinth. Now, for reference point, on the top of this hill, way in the back, in the middle of the screen there, you can see like this little structure, and that's going to be important because we're gonna take pictures from there down at the city though. But this is the ruins of the temple. I have another slide number 3 here. I'm just showing you. This is what the temple of the goddess Aphrodite looked like. So this is the ruins there in Corinth. I have another slide number 4 here. And again, you can see this is some of the ruins. You've got the mountain in the background with that little building thing on the top. So Corinth location was actually pretty critical. It's literally the crossroads through the whole entire Roman Empire. Okay, there was a lot of commerce that happened in the city of Corinth. There's a lot of people who were traveling there on a regular basis. I have another slide 5. Now, this is what Corinth would look like back in Paul's day. This is the drawing of it, but you have the temple here. This is the ruins that we saw, that big building right there. And then if you're looking at it, if you're in the hills right there in that drawing looking towards me, that mountain would be right here. So the mountain would literally be right where I'm standing versus the city being there. Now, if you go just past the very top, you can see there's water up there. There's going to be a big old giant ocean that's going to be right there in Corinth. Okay, another slide. Slide 6. Again, this is some more ruins. You have the building in the background. The water would be behind you as you're taking the picture. If you were to turn around, you have the ocean on the other side. I have another slide 8. Oh, that's slide 7. Now, this is on top of that mountain. Remember I said it had those little buildings there? So now you can see the little bricks there. They're looking at the city of Corinth. This is the city of Corinth right here. It's right there on the waters, that big old giant thing. This is modern day Corinth, right today. Now, you can't see this. We'll show this in a minute. But if you were to go right above where the city is, right in the middle of the water, there's going to be a little canal that kind of goes through the land, which we'll see that in a minute. Slide 7. Go to slide number 8. This is the road that goes through Corinth. Again, there's the city in the background on the hill that has that little fort there. Now, this is all part of the Roman Empire. Okay? Now, here's a map to show us where Corinth is in reference to the Roman Empire. So, another slide. So, Corinth is circled there. Jerusalem is down on the bottom. If you go up to where the little star is, this is where Paul's home church, Antioch of Syria, is. If you're to go off the screen towards our door that way, you're going to have Rome, Italy over there. So this is kind of the whole area here of where Corinth sits. It's that little dot right there on the island of Achaia. Okay, now, this is all part of the Roman Empire. I have another slide. I have a lot of slides because I think it's important for us to get our bearings here. Slide number 10. So this is a close-up of Corinth. There's that line there that we're going to talk about, which is the Trans-Isthmian route. But right now I want to talk about Cape Malea. So Cape Malea was a problem in Paul's day because it was known as a graveyard to the ships because it would, no matter what, ships would always crash and burn there. They would literally, the winds and all the different things there were really, really powerful. And so it was a problem for them. There were more shipwrecks there than probably any other part of the European landscape in that time. Now, many times, sailors would, before they would go and sail Cape Malea right there, because remember, Rome's on this side and Jerusalem's on this side, right? So you got two different sides. And before they would sail that little route, they would have to write their wills to their families because the chances of them making that was a problem. They would probably die. That's how many times ships would crash in there. Okay? I have another slide here. So this is modern day. This is a Google map here. So there's Rome on the very, if you're looking at it on the left, You have Ephesus, I circled down. Jerusalem, Lebanon would be down in the corner. And Corinth is right there in the center of that. You have the Black Sea, which we'll talk about later on in our text. But you have these different seas here. And so they would go around the bottom of Cape Malea to get to Corinth, and that's how they would do that. But that would be a problem. So if a person wanted to go, let's say, from Rome to either Ephesus or down to Jerusalem, they'd have to travel around Cape Malea, and that was a graveyard of ships, so it was a big, big deal. Now, there's a huge harbor in Corinth. So Corinth has got this little 4-mile stretch of land, and there's oceans on both sides of it. And so there's a harbor in Corinth, and then the other one, which is going to be like, I think, Centuria or something like that, is another harbor. So there's a huge harbor there, and there's this 4-mile canal. It's called the Isthmus of Corinth. I have some slides here just to kind of show what this is. Slide number 12. So there's a 4-mile stretch. You can see that land, and that's a canal that was dug out. It's a 4-mile strip here that prevented the ships from the East Ocean to go to the West Ocean. And so that's 4 miles right there. I have another slide number 13. So there's Corinth. I've circled it right there. And you have the ocean on one side and the ocean on the other. And that 4-mile strip of land is stopping these ships from being able to just travel through. So they have to go down through the bottom of there. But that's a problem because that's now a graveyard of ships. Okay? Now let's go back to slide 10. It's just the next slide over. No, just go forward. Yeah, there we go. So again, there it is. It's the Trans-Ithinian route right there. That's something that 4-mile strip of land. You can see Corinth right there. And so if you went to Rome, a lot of times what they would do, because it was so dangerous, is if you had a small boat, they would, let's say you were in the Aegean Sea there, if you're coming from Jerusalem, they would harbor over on the one side. They would unload all their cargo and take, if it's a small boat, and they would take their boat and roll it across this 4-mile strip of land and go into the other strip. But if it was a big boat, oftentimes you'd have ships on both sides, and one would come on one side, they would unload all their cargo, carry it over the 4-mile strip of land, and load the other ship, because that bottom Cape Malea was so dangerous. And because they would do that, Corinth, sometimes the sailors would be in there for a month at a time. They would harbor there for a long period of time, especially in the winter months, because it's and you have these sailors who are away from home in a place like Vegas, who are normal people like we see today, right? What are they going to do when they're on leave, sailors, in a harbor that's like Vegas? I mean, we don't have to do the math. There's 1,000 priestesses in the temple that you can pay, and they can prophesy over you as they're having sexual relations with them. I mean, this is what they're going to do. It's a place of, they're going to get drunk. It's a party place. It's a place to just do whatever you want. It's called Sin City.
What happens in Corinth
stays in Corinth. Yep. What happens in Corinth stays in Corinth. Okay. Now, I have another slide, right here, slide 14. So, this is now what they have done through this 4-mile strip. This is modern day, it's what we call the canal. Now, Nero in the Bible, that bad guy, started to dig through this and started to create this, but he never finished it. In fact, this canal here was finished in the 1800s. And it's a way for them to bypass that graveyard of ships and just to cut through that 4-mile stretch. So this is how they do it now. They just kind of go through that whole thing there. So when you think of Corinth, again, it's an immoral city. It's a place that's highly traveled. Now think about this, okay? Those ships are in that harbor. Paul's in this city. It's not theologians. It's not, what do you call it? Agnostics there per se. It's not those, what we call the philosophers. But they're sailors that are there months and months at a time, and they're away from home, and they're given over to these things. And they worship the well-known god Aphrodite, the god of love. Now, they don't have to be, they don't have to follow that religion to go into the temple. They can just say, oh, yeah, I'm going to go visit, I'm going to go worship right now. Be back in 2 hours,
Wow, that's pretty generous.
Well, they have to walk there first. Most of that's travel time. But they would come into this city and they would engage in sexual immorality. which was a part of their worship and a part of their culture. They would drink, they would get drunk, they would party. And this is the kind of place that Paul comes to. This is what Corinth is, okay? It's very different than Athens, where he left, which is just philosophical thought, and universities, and the education capital of the Roman Empire. And so we're going to pick up our text in Acts 18 with that background. I think that background is really important, so we know where he's at and what he's doing here. Now, it says in Acts 18, remember we're doing 1 through 23, so I got a lot to cover today. Acts 18 verses 1 and 2 says this: after these things, after he's talked with these leaders, he said, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, male, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and he came to them. So now we're going to be introduced to this incredible power couple, this husband and wife, here in Corinth. And the reason they're in Corinth is because they were kicked out of Rome. All the Jews were kicked out of Rome. So we know they're Jews because it says it, first of all, but they were kicked out of Rome. And it says in verse 3, Acts 18:3, so because this is Aquila, was of the same trade, Paul is of the same trade as Aquila, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. So Aquila and Paul are both tent makers. They have a trade. This is how they bring in their money. They're teaming up together. That's what it sees here. So Paul leaves Athens, comes to Corinth, and while in Corinth, Paul finds this couple of the same trade, which makes sense. Because he's going to go there, he needs money, he's going to go into the marketplace and set up his booth and start saying, hey, I'm a tent maker, and start making things. And then he's going to meet these same people who do the same thing. Okay? Now it's important that they're tent makers by trade. Okay? Now Aquila and Priscilla are from Pontus. Pontus is by the Black Sea that we saw. I have another slide 15 here. Okay? So there's Rome, there's Corinth, they're in Corinth, but their homeland, Aquila and Priscilla, are from Pontus, which is by the Black Sea. Now I have the previous slide, I just want to show it again. Next slide, 15b. Again, so there's Corinth, there's Rome, Ephesus, and then Pontus is up on the top by the Black Sea. This is where they're from. They were in Rome. They were born in Pontus, but they're in Rome. They get kicked out of Rome, and now they're in Corinth, which is the center of the Roman Empire. It's really like the main place there. And they both have the same occupation. Aquila and Paul are both tent makers, and Aquila and Priscilla were kicked out of Rome. Now, what's interesting about being kicked out of Rome, and I find this, it's actually pretty cool, is secular history. So when I say secular history, this is non-biblical history. This is history that validates what the Bible says. Secular history records that Claudius kicked out every single Jew in Rome between AD 49 and AD 50, probably closer to AD 49. Now, why were the Jews kicked out? It's okay, I'm going to tell you. Okay? There were riots that were happening in Rome. And according to historical documents, the riots that were happening were centered around this person named Chestus. Now I have another slide here, or Crestus, I should say. I'm going to leave this up for a few minutes here. Many scholars believe that this guy, Crestus, is a misspelling of the person Christ. Now let's think about this. The Jews are rioting over this guy named Christ. And because they're rioting over Christ, because they think it's a misspelling, this Crestus, they're kicked out of out of the city of Rome. Okay? Now, do the Jews riot over Christ? This is where we answer, this is yes, this is no. It's where we use our words. Yes! Have we seen the Jews riot over Christ?
Yeah.
Where have we seen it?
In the Bible.
But where?
Everywhere.
Everywhere Paul went, right? Philippi. I mean, they're rioting. He has to flee. He goes to Thessalonica. They're rioting. He has to flee. Berea, they're rioting. He has to flee. The Jews are rioting everywhere. When he was on his first missionary journey in Antioch of Pisidia, they rioted. In Derbe, they rioted over this person named Christ. So it's very plausible that this guy, Crestus, isn't a Roman person. It's actually, they're doing it over Jesus. Because every time, think about it. In Acts chapter 1, verse 8, It talks about, Jesus said, you're going to be witnesses to me in Jerusalem, in Judea, into Samaria, to the ends of the earth. And then in Acts chapter 9, or chapter 8, chapter 9, Stephen is killed and the church is scattered. And we know that there are people from Rome that were there on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. Those people are scattered. They go back to Rome. They're preaching Jesus. Riots happen. The Jews are kicked out of Rome. And now they're this power couple is in Corinth. Okay? So it's plausible that Aquila and Priscilla, they're already believers, which would make sense is why Paul would house with them and stay with them. Now it says in Acts 18:3, so because he was of the same trade, Paul, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. Now here's another interesting fact. Jewish culture, they believed in a couple things that we well, let me just say it this way. The Jewish father, it was almost like a requirement in the culture to teach your son a trade. The Jews didn't believe in taking a salary. They believed that you should work that you should earn your pay. And so what would happen is they would teach their son the trade that they had. And so we know that Paul was a tent maker, which means that Paul's dad was a tent maker, that Paul's grandfather was a tent maker. And this is how they would do these things in this culture. We see that with Jesus. What was Jesus' trade?
Carpenter.
He was a carpenter, which means what? That his earthly father was a
Carpenter.
and that person's father, Joseph's father, was probably a carpenter too. And it was something that they did. They had this saying that if you teach your son a trade, that if you don't teach your son a trade, this is what the rabbis would say, if you don't teach your son a trade, then you're teaching them to be a thief. And so you always wanted to teach them to work with their own hands, to be able to provide for their own families, to be able to do their own thing through their trade. If they don't know a trade, they're gonna rob and steal. And so that was their saying. Now the rabbis never wanted to take a salary. They always wanted to trade. And we see this in Paul's ministry, that Paul he's a pastor, he's planting churches, but he's also a tent maker, and he will use his trade as a way to support himself at times when he's doing ministry. Okay? Now, that's the model that we here at Deeper Waters Christian Ministries follow. We think it's important. Now, it doesn't mean it's always going to stay that way, because Paul, we'll see in our text that Paul at times will take a salary, he'll take financial help from the church, and he'll stop working and he'll work in the church, and other times he'll work in his trade. And that's kind of the model that we follow. That we here at this church, we don't take a salary. Like, I have a secular job. We all have jobs. And we come here and volunteer. And we do this for multiple reasons. The first reason is the community that we're trying to reach have a really hard time with the church right now and evangelical, what's going on in our political climate. And they think that they're in it for the money. And you see these television, TV evangelists, and you see people fleecing the flock, and you see all of this garbage. I'm like, I want nothing to do with that. And so they come to me like, I don't want to go, you're just in it for the money. And I'm like, well, actually, let me tell you, I'm not. I'm not. It's all volunteer-based. And so it kind of breaks that door down because they can't use that argument. Okay? But the other reason that we don't do this, and again, it doesn't mean that it won't change over time, and we're going to see why it may have to change at times in Paul's life. But the other reason why we don't do this, we do volunteer status, is when we go into and we start to plant a church somewhere else. Our job is we want to raise up the locals and have them do the same model where they can work and start ministering and winning people, because it just takes that whole argument away. Okay? So, again, because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. Okay? Now, Paul is a hard-working person. I don't know if you guys know that. Paul didn't just receive. He worked really hard. And I think this is a critical quality that a pastor should have, that he should be hard-working, but not just pastors. Anyone who's in ministry ought to be hard workers. And if we're not going to be hard workers, that's going to be a problem, because Paul is a hard worker. He didn't just receive, he gave. Okay? Ministry isn't for the lazy-hearted. It's difficult, challenging, soul-wrenching work at times. There's times when I have to go up into my room and sit in the fetal position and rock like a baby sucking my thumb because it's so hard. It's difficult. It's not for the lazy mind, for lazy people. Charles Spurgeon, he was lecturing his students. He wrote a book called Lectures to My Students. He said this, and I quote, he said, God doesn't want the guy who can't do anything in the world leading the church. Meaning this, if the person doesn't follow through outside the church and isn't a hard worker outside the church, God doesn't want that person leading the church. God doesn't want to put that person in a position of leadership if they're not hard workers outside of the church. Because the reality is, if you're a hard worker outside of the church, you're probably going to be a hard worker inside the church. But here's the other reality. If you're not a hard worker outside of the church, you're probably going to work even less harder in the church. Ministry is hard work. It's hard. It's difficult. Especially, and I think about with our model, I work 40 to 50 hours a week outside. And then I work full-time as a pastor. It's difficult, but it's worth it. But it's difficult. It's difficult. Now, let me ask this. If you can't follow through, let's say with your schoolwork, your job, your personal commitments, why would God let you lead the church? And think about this logically. God wants follow through. He says at the end of when there's a passage in Matthew, which I might mention later, but at the end of our race, when we come home to the Lord, He doesn't say, well done, my good and almost followed through servant. He says, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful with a few things, I'll make you ruler over many. He cares about faithfulness. He wants us to be faithful. Now, God is looking not just for men, but for women. Hard-working men and women. And we think that, when we're in full-time ministry, that's it. I've got a title. I've attained it. This is what I want. Like that title does anything. Titles don't do anything. It's not like in the book of Acts, you don't, show me in the book of Acts where you're like, well, that's a full-timer, and that's a part-timer Christian. Like, they're in full-time ministry, they're part. You don't see that in the book of Acts. We're all called to be ministering, in ministry, and ministers. Now, some of us minister in the church, and some of us minister outside the church. Let me say it this way. All of us should minister in the church, and all of us should minister outside the church. It's biblical.
Amen.
It's biblical. What we see in the book of Acts is they just serve God. And I think we romanticize titles. Well, if I could just get on staff. If I could just be employed by the church, everything in my life would be so much better. Okay? But that's a misconception. That's not true. Now, don't get me wrong. Paul did at times in his life work full-time for the church, where the church paid him to do the work. Now, he did that at times. But there are other times when he took a secular job and he was a tent maker. And in both avenues, when Paul worked part-time, when he worked in the world, people were blessed. And when he worked in the church and received a salary from the church, people were blessed. In fact, Paul writes to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 9, he talks about how it is good for a person who's pastoring a church that they should be supported and ministered to materially. Now, watch this. We've got 14 verses here. Listen to what Paul says here. And I love his conclusion here because he said, I didn't take anything from you. But he's just establishing some boundaries here. And he says, 1 Corinthians 9:1, am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? He's talking to the church that he planted. If I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you, or no doubt I'm one to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense to those who examine me is this. Now he's giving a defense because people are saying, listen, you are an apostle. You can't take a salad. You can't. This is his defense. Do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles? What other apostles? The brothers of Lord and Cephas, which is Peter, by the way. Peter's got a wife. Why can't we get married, is what he's saying here. Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working, referring to a secular job? Are we the only one out of all of God's kingdom that are not allowed that we have to work a secular job while we do ministry? Whoever goes to war at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit? Or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock? It's logical. Do I say these things as a mere man, or does not the law say the same thing also? For it is written in the scriptures, in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Meaning, if they're doing the work, feed them. If they're doing the work, pay them. Again, I'm not asking for money, so let's just keep this clear. This is not about that. But this is an important lesson for our church, okay? Is it oxen? Is it oxen God is concerned about? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partakers of his hope. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? We're doing the work, is what he's saying. And I love what he says here. Nevertheless, we have not used this right. And this is where we stand here at Deeper Waters. We don't use this right. Though we have this right, we lay this right down. But endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offering of the altar? Even so the Lord has commanded, not suggested, has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. And what he's saying here is when a pastor does all the hard work, they should get paid for their services. But we haven't done that. We've laid that aside, and I absolutely will not take a salary. I think for us, it's not even possible. That's not my point here. My point here is when Paul is working a secular job, it limits his ability to fully engage in the church. You can't work a 40, 50-hour secular job and then do 40, 50 hours in the church. It's not possible. And so if you want someone to be more effective in ministry, you've got to make room for them to have the ability to be effective in ministry. And the more time you can give someone to devote to the ministry, the more effective they can be. Okay? For example, I can't teach the way that I teach without studying the way that I study. And I study between 8 to 16 hours per message, and I do 3 messages a week while working a secular job. So I'm studying about 40 hours a week to teach 3 messages a week. Now that can't be done. Now I can say, well, we can stop teaching, or I can teach less, but it takes effort, it takes work. There's got to be room for that. Okay? I can't meet with people. I can't minister and lead our fellowship the way that people expect me to, because they're like, you're not available, Amy. Why are you never available? It's because I work a secular job. I can't do both. If I'm doing one, I can't do the other. If I'm at work, I can't minister here at the church. And if I'm at church, I obviously can't be working. And so it's just a logical argument that he says. Okay? Now, what I do is I take the time that I have and I minister in the most effective way that is humanly possible. But there are going to be hiccups. Like if you want to meet with me tonight, and I say I can't meet with you until Thursday, there has to be room for that if I'm not working and I'm not paid by the church. Right? I mean, it's just logical. So, and I don't want to be paid by the church. This isn't about that. But my point here is we've got to lower the expectations of leadership in the church if they're working a full-time job. You can't expect them to be available like that. I need you now. Okay, well, I'm sorry, so does my boss. Okay, I may be my own boss, but, my job needs me now too. So now I have to make a decision, like, okay, who's going to pay my bills? My job is. So I have to give time to my job to pay my bills, and then we have to make the appointment on Thursday instead of tonight. And so that's kind of what Paul's doing here. He's like, listen, we have the right to partake of it. We didn't. But the consequences of that is you can't have the accessibility that you think that you have at other churches who their pastors and staff are paid by the church. So that's a consequence of doing it the style that we do. Yes, we don't want to do it. We don't want to have, right now no one takes a salary, but the problem with that is you got to give some grace. You got to give grace that if we're all working secular jobs, we can't always be available. And you're like, well, you're off at 5. Yeah, okay, but I might be spent. Like, I just had a really bad day at work, and I need some time. I have to go take care of my kids and my family, and there's just a lot. So I'm just not as available as I would like to be, and we got to get grace for that. So, so Paul's a hard worker, is my point. When Paul was in Corinth, now remember, he left Athens, he went to Corinth. When he was in Corinth, he wrote to the church in Thessalonica that he planted. And he says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9, he says, for you remember, brethren, that our labor and toil, for laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, we preach to you the gospel of God. So he worked all the time. He's a hard worker. But again, when you're working a secular job, if you're making tents, if you're doing something else, it limits your availability. And Paul says, listen, I worked with my hands, my own hands. I didn't take anything from you. He says in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 7 through 9, he says, for you yourselves know how you ought to follow us. For we were not disorderly among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread free of charge, but worked with labor and toil night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. But not because we do not have authority. We have authority. Like, I have authority as a pastor to take a salary from the church. We didn't, but we laid down an authority to make ourselves an example of how you should follow us. In church, I work really hard. You guys that know me know I work really, really hard. I do everything in my power to position myself to be able to minister to you guys. But the reality is there's only a certain amount of hours in a day, and when I'm given a big chunk of those hours somewhere else to work, then those chunk of hours aren't available. And again, I feel like sometimes, and it's feeling, but like there's not enough grace there. That there's an expectation that I should be doing what full-time pastors do. And it's not feasible. It's not logical, and it's not fair. It's not fair to put that burden on one person when we all have to work secular jobs. You know what I mean? So we've got to come back down to reality a little bit. So it's a little home lesson here. That if I'm going to work, which I want to and I need to and I'm going to out there, I cannot be available here when I'm there. So there's got to be some grace. Okay? Now, ministering is hard work. It's challenging. It's difficult. Paul says in the very next verse, in verse 10 here of chapter 3 of 2 Thessalonians, he says, for even when we were still with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. Now, I think this is an important topic as we establish where our vision is at the church, okay? We ought to be working hard when serving the Lord.
Amen.
And far too often, and I'm going to be real honest, and this is a problem in the evangelical church as a whole, serving the Lord is an afterthought. It's an afterthought. We come to church and we just like, well, I'm here to receive. No, you're here to serve. You're here to serve the Lord with everything in you. And we do it as an afterthought. Yeah, I'm a Christian, I serve, but then when it comes down to it, you're like, And I'm just talking about the church as a whole. Not us, Deeper Waters. We are lucky here at Deeper Waters. We have 100% of people in our church serving, which is good. It's good. We've got higher stats than all of them, but it's a problem. It's a problem that we don't give our best when we serve, that we don't do, we kind of just like coast through serving the Lord instead of giving that hard work that we do outside of the church, bringing that same thing into the church. Now, Paul is talking to elders in Ephesus in Acts chapter 20, and he's talking to the pastors, and he says this in Acts chapter 20, verse 33 and 34. He says, and I love this. He says, I have coveted, I've taken no one's silver or gold or apparel. I haven't taken anybody's money. Yes, you yourselves know that these hands have provided for my necessities and for those who were with me. So Paul worked really hard, okay? But not only is he a hard worker, but he's also a giving man. So he's working a secular job and he's taking some of his fruit and he's giving it. He's providing for other people. Okay? He poured into people spiritually, physically, and financially. And I want to say something, I'm going to speak against our culture, and especially church culture, okay? Giving of our time, though it's important, is not what we're called to give. Okay? We're called to give our hard work. We're called to work hard, church. And oftentimes, and again, this isn't a message of Deeper Waters, we are good. We are doing, we're okay. But when you talk about hard work, the fruit of your hard work is finances. God put you in a place to help other people. You've got to position yourselves to help other people. It's not about just your kingdom. It's about His kingdom. And so we want to make sure that we're positioning ourselves as hard workers, that we're working very hard, and we're also providing for Him, for His kingdom. Okay? We ought to give our hard work, which is what our finances represent, to the Lord. Okay? Paul says in Acts, in the next verse, 20:35, says, I have shown you in every way, by laboring like this, that you must support the weak. And remember the words of the Lord Jesus, that He said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. I'm not even talking about giving to the church. I'm just talking about being Christians, giving some of our resources to help people, not just to build our own earthly kingdom. Okay? Now, I love this because this is true. It is so much more blessed to give than to receive. Don't get me wrong. I know most of us, if not all of us in the church, have had seasons where we've had to receive and it was a blessing. I was homeless for a year, a full year homeless. Receiving was a blessing. But I'll tell you what, giving far outweighs receiving. Giving to people and helping people and being able to be that person that gets them through something is so, so powerful. It is definitely more blessed to give than to receive. Okay? Now, again, I've shown you in every way, by laboring like this, that you must support the weak. And remember the words of the Lord Jesus that He said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. So Paul's philosophy in ministry was this. Do whatever it takes. No one gets a free ride. Work hard. That is the philosophy we have here at Deeper Waters. Okay? Do whatever it takes. Nobody gets a free ride, and work hard. Because that's the only way that the church is going to thrive. Nobody gets a free ride. Do whatever it takes to win people and work hard. So listen, when someone works hard in the secular world, and then they come into the church, and they eventually get raised up, and they are in ministry, the reality is if they worked hard in the world, they're probably going to work just as hard in the church. And the advantage of someone working hard in the church in leadership is they're not going to need to be micromanaged. They're not going to need to have, hey, did you do this? Did you do that? But they're going to take the initiative and take the reins and run in their ministry. And they're going to be able to produce fruit in the position that they're in because they're hard workers. They're hard workers. The flip side, those who've never really worked hard in the world and have had a free ride, they don't know how to be self-motivated. They don't know what it is to be hardworking, okay? Paul was a hard worker. He laid down his life for sheep, literally. And going back to our text, it says in Acts 18:4, and he reasoned in the synagogue, this is Paul, every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. Now, I want you to notice something here that I think we miss when we read this. Paul's ministry here is a lot lighter than it was in other places. Why do you think he's not doing as much? I'll tell you why. Because he's working a secular job. He's tent making, so he's only reasoning on once a week here. Because he's got to work a job. This is exactly what's happening here, okay? When pastors are working a secular job, it takes away again from our accessibility, access. Now, interesting, verse 4, Paul is working a secular job. In verse 5, something changes, and we're going to see this, Acts 18:5. So Paul's working a secular job. He's tent making. He's reasoning only on Saturdays. 1 day a week is the only time he's ministering. And this is, when Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. Now, what's interesting here is these guys come back from the church of Thessalonica, really, and when Paul writes to the Thessalonians, he says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, referring to Paul, Timothy, and Silas here, he says this, 1 Thessalonians 3, 1 and 2, therefore, when we can no longer endure it, We thought it good to be in Athens alone, and sent Timothy, our brother, and we know Silas is with him in this, by the way, and minister of God and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and encourage you concerning the faith. So he's in Athens, he sends them to Macedonia. Okay? So they go to Thessalonica, we know that. They give a great report, but when they come back from Thessalonica, they come back with financial help. And we know that. How do we know that? Because it's
In the Bible.
yeah. We get it from 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 9, which says this. And he's talking to the Corinthians now. The Timothy and Silas have come back from Thessalonica, and he says this. And when I was present with you, and in need, is when I was working my secular job, I was a burden to no one. For what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. They came back with financial help, okay? Now again, when Paul writes to Philippians, in Philippians chapter 4, this ties in with this, verse 15, he says, now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, this is when he went down to Corinth, Athens, Corinth, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. So Paul's working a secular job in Corinth. He's only able to minister once a week. He had sent Timothy and Silas up to Thessalonica. Thessalonica is only about 30 miles or so from Philippi. Philippi sends some relief to Timothy and Silas. They bring that relief back to Paul, and then he's able to stop working and go into full-time ministry. He's able to do more because the church is now supplying his need. And again, there's grace there, right? When he's working a secular job, he's limited. When he's got financial help, he's able to do a lot more. Very practical. It's just very, very practical, okay? Now, the church of Philippi was an incredibly supportive and giving church to the ministry of Paul, okay? And that's the benefit of having a pastor that's employed by the church through tithes and offering, because the benefit is they're a lot more available. So if you guys want your pastor to be a lot more available, we have to make some changes, but I don't want to make changes. So you have to be gracious. You have to be gracious. There's a huge difference between verse 4 and verse 5 in our Acts 18 text, okay? Paul is compelled to testify by the Spirit once he has the financial means to do so. The word compelled, it means devoted in the Greek, okay? He was more devoted to the evangelical ministry because he had financial assistance. He didn't have to spend his time focusing on work. And you know how it is. You guys all have jobs, right? Where you've had jobs where you work and you're focused on whatever you've got to do, your task. And when you get home, it's hard to transition from that work mode into jumping into another full-time job. Yeah. You've got to have that transition time. You just can't go. You can't just go. You eventually burn yourself out. So Paul says in Acts 18:6, he says, but when they opposed him, now he's doing full-time ministry. The brethren have already come back. They've given him some financial help. He's not tent making right now. He's got the money to be able to engage in full-time ministry. But when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Now, this is a pattern that we see all throughout Paul's ministry, okay? So he comes to Corinth, and what happens now? He receives some more what? Persecution. Okay? He shares the gospel, he goes to the synagogues, they reject him, he goes to the the Gentiles. But every time he goes into the religious system of his day, which would be like us going into the evangelical church and saying, hey, God's all inclusive, they persecute him. And so we start to see this pattern, And I think about this and I'm like, well, maybe the Lord in the past has spoken something to you and something's happened and you've experienced something. But think about Paul. He went to Philippi, he's persecuted. He goes to Thessalonica, he's persecuted. He goes to Berea, he's persecuted. He goes to Athens, we don't see that he's persecuted there, a little bit of relief. But then he goes to Corinth and now he's being persecuted again. So he's struggling. Because every time he was persecuted in the past, he had to flee. So he's contemplating, do I flee this city? Like, is my life in danger? The pattern is I share the gospel and they hate me and they try to kill me. Do I need to leave now? And that's kind of where he's at. But Paul doesn't leave this city. He's going to stay. And we're going to see something really cool here, okay? He says, now I turn to the Gentiles. And more often than not, when we endure affliction, it produces good things in us. How do I know?
To the Bible.
It's in the Bible. James chapter 1, verse 2 through 4 says this. My brethren, Christian, man, woman, believer, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Okay, let me ask this. Whenever one of you guys have fallen, was it joyful?
No.
What happens when you fall into trials? I mean, this is like ridiculous. If you stop there at verse 2 here, right? My brethren, count all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing, and here's the key, knowing, you can know something, that the testing of your faith, these trials, produce patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Are you lacking in your life today? When you fall into a trial, are you trying to squirm your way out of it? So Paul gives the gospel to the Jews, and then he gives it to the Gentiles. He gives the all-inclusive gospel to the Jews, and they reject it. And then Paul uses this phrase here that we only see 2 times in the book of Acts. It's here in verse 6, Acts 18:6. It says, he shook his garment and said to them, your blood be upon your own heads, I am clean. And he says the same thing later on in Acts chapter 20, verses 26 and 27. He says, talking to the Jews again, therefore I testify to you this day, I am innocent of the blood of all men. He's talking to the leadership in Ephesus at this point. For I have not shunned to declare you the whole counsel of God. So, there's this idea of being innocent of the blood of all men. What is Paul talking about? Any idea? No idea? Okay. Paul is talking about Old Testament scripture that he lived his life by. And it comes from Ezekiel chapter 33, verses 1 through 9. I'll read it because this is the pattern that Paul's going to follow. I'm innocent of the blood of all men. And he says this. Again, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, speak to the children of your people and say to them, when I bring the sword upon the land, and the people of the land take a man from their territory and make him their watchman, when he sees the sword coming upon the land, if he blows the trumpet and warns the people, then whoever hears the sound of the trumpet and does not take warning, if the sword comes and takes him away, his blood shall be on his own head. So here's the analogy. You're a watchman, right? You're on the tower, you see the enemy coming, you blow the horn, so you warn, hey, the enemy's coming. If they decide to just roll over and go back to sleep and they are killed, their blood is on their own head. That's what he's saying here. Okay? Verse 4, then whoever hears the sound of the trumpet and does not take the warning, if the sword comes and takes him away, his blood shall be on his own head. Verse 5, he heard the sound of the trumpet, but did not take warning. His blood shall be upon himself. But he who takes warning shall save his life. Now here's the key here. But if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet, and the people are not warned, and the sword comes and takes any person from among them, he is taken away in his sin and his iniquity. But his blood I will require at the watchman's hand. Same analogy. You're on there. You see the enemy coming, and you're afraid. You don't share. I know, the enemy's coming. And they come in and take them away. Their blood is now on your hands. That's what he's saying. So verse 7. So you, son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. Therefore you shall hear a word from my mouth and warn them for me. When I say to the wicked, to sinners, O wicked man, you shall surely die. And you do not speak to warn the wicked from his way. That wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hand. Nevertheless, if you warn the wicked to turn from his way, and he does not turn from his way, he shall die in his iniquity, but you have delivered your soul, meaning that I will not require his blood at your own hand. Okay? So that's what God tells Ezekiel, that you're a watchman, that your job is to warn. You don't have to convert, you don't have to convince. You see something, you blow the horn. Okay? And that is what Paul is doing in our access. He's living this out. He's sharing the gospel, and they're rejecting him. He's like, listen, your blood be on your own hands. I am clean. I have done my part. I have given you the warning. I've given you the gospel. I've told you that if you don't receive Jesus, you will die in your sin. I've given it. Your blood is now on your own hands. I'm going to the Gentiles. That's what he's telling them. I've shared the message with you. Okay? Now, he wrote this very thing in 1 Corinthians, to the Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 9:16, he says, "For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe to me if I do not preach the gospel." This is where Paul's at in his mindset. He said in Romans chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, he says, "I am a debtor. I am indebted both to Greeks and to barbarians." This is educated and uneducated. "Both to wise and unwise. So as much as is in me, I'm ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also." So Paul saw himself as a watchman, that his job was to proclaim, to share, not to convert, but just to share what God has laid on his heart, to warn people that Jesus is the only way. If you try to get there without atonement, you're not going to get there. You don't have enough resources to pay for your sin. But he does. And if you reject it, that's on you. I don't have to convert. I don't have to Bible bash, throw your head in the toilet, like, believe in Jesus. True story. Sadly. I'll get into that another time. Paul saw himself as a debtor. He's washing his hands in our Acts 18 text because he's given them the message. And it's like liberating to me because I think sometimes we feel so obligated to convert people. But we can't. See, you can argue someone into God's kingdom and someone else can argue them out. God is the only one who can convert. All we have to do is share the message. That is it. That is our call. To share the message. That Jesus is the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father but through him. That's John 14:6, by the way. Romans 5:8. That God demonstrates his own love towards us and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That's all we have to share. I don't believe in that garbage. Okay, well, your blood be on your own hands. I've done my part. But I would hate to stand before God on that day and see one of my friends who I've said 1,000 times, "Oh, I love you, you're one of my closest friends." And as they're being dragged away from God's presence, they say, "Why didn't you ever tell me? You knew the whole time? You said you love me and you never told me? How is that love?" I would just hate to be in that position. We are called to warn, we're called to share, and that is it. Okay? Now, here's the thing that we need to be careful of, because I've heard this in our church. "I've never led anybody to Christ. I don't know if I'm walking with the Lord. I've never led them to Christ." Do not evaluate your spiritual success on how many people you've led to Christ. Evaluate your spiritual success on how many people you've told about Christ. Okay? It's not, yes, we want to lead people. It's an incredible blessing. But your success isn't based on conversion. It's based on you sharing the message. We know prophets from the Old Testament who shared for 40 years. Jeremiah shared the gospel message for 40 years and had 0 converts. 0. Do you think he was not effective in God's kingdom? He's a prophet. Of course he was effective. We're reading his writings today in our time. Because it's not about us converting, it's about us sharing. So, Paul leaves the religious system, the religious system of his time, the synagogue, which we would share the all-inclusive gospel to the religious system of our time. They would reject it, and we move on to the next group. That's what he's doing. And it says in Acts 18:7, "And he departed from there, from the synagogue, and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshipped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue." So, I love this because Paul's like, "I'm out of here. I'm going to go to the Gentiles." And he goes all the way to next door. Like, he literally just walks next door. I'm not going far. I'm preaching the gospel. Like, you don't want to hear it? I'm going to go to this guy right here. And he says in verse 8, "Then Crispus," now this is cool. "Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all of his household, and many of the Corinthians hearing believed and were baptized." Now I want you to notice something, because I think this is going to be a good parallel for our church, okay? Paul's ministry in Corinth started off slow. So I even know that. Started off really, really slow. Okay? It started off with him working hard and doing tent making and reasoning in the synagogues once a week. That's what it was. Okay? And I'm sure there are days when he's there and he's tired and he's exhausted, especially after a full day's work, right? He's got to make that deadline. The guy needs the tent. They don't want to be homeless. So he's got to do that. He's like, oh, I'm supposed to go to synagogue. Uh-oh. So he's exhausted. And I'm sure he's asking himself when he's in that place, because remember, he's on his missionary journey. He left Antioch of Syria. He's traveled through 6 countries. And I'm sure as he's making his tent, he's like, what am I doing here? Like, I'm literally just making tents. I'm not being effective. No one's coming to the Lord. Like, why am I even here? Because Paul's like us. We would ask the same thing. Like, well, I'm in another country. I'm at this church, and I'm just kind of here doing my job. I wake up, I go to work, I come home, I go to sleep, and I wake up and go to work, and I'm not seeing any fruit. And Paul didn't see any fruit right away. Paul's probably asking, like, Lord, is there more than this? Like, this is all I got? Like, you have me here. Am I just going to be making tents the rest of my life and sharing and nobody coming to Jesus? Interesting, he says in 1 Corinthians 1:14, because we know that in Acts 18:8, Crispus, which is the ruler of the synagogue, he's the pastor of the synagogue, gets saved. And he says in 1 Corinthians 1:14, Paul says, I thank God that I baptized none of you in Corinth, except for Crispus and Gaius. So Paul baptizes this religious Jewish leader, the pastor of the church of the religious system in Corinth. And he says in Acts 18:8, then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians hearing believed and were baptized. Now, when Crispus gets saved, we know that, we'll find this later on in different texts, that he loses his position as the rabbi of the synagogue. There's going to be another person that's going to come in there and take his place, because you can't because they believe that if he became a Christian, he rejected Judaism, so he can't lead this march in Judaism if he's a believer. So they replace him with another guy. Okay? But I love this because there's a great harvest with the Gentiles. And even though the fruit is towards the Gentiles, this Jewish religious leader gets saved in the midst of Paul going to the Gentiles. And we equate this a lot of times here, where we leave the evangelical Western movement and we're trying to reach the LGBT community. Because there are a lot of similarities between the religious system of that day and our day, and the Gentiles of that day and the LGBT of our day. Because the religious system in Paul's day said that the Gentiles were the fuel to the fire of hell. There's no way that they were created and designed by God to warm up hell, that they can't get saved. And Paul's like, no, God's all inclusive. And we see the same thing today, where the evangelical system says, listen, if you're LGBT, you can't be saved. You have to abandon all of that stuff. And Paul's like, no, you don't. No, you don't. And so he goes to the Gentiles. Very, very similar similarities there. And he says in Acts 18, verses 9 through 11, he says, now the Lord spoke to Paul in a night by a vision. And this is what the Lord says. Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not keep silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you. For I have many people in this city. And he continued there 1 year and 6 months teaching the word of God. Now, do you remember when we started this study today? I said when Paul came to the place of Corinth, he came in brokenness and weakness. I said, put that in your mind. Okay, well, let's tie this in together with this, okay? Paul came to Corinth with much trembling, fear. Why? Because he's been persecuted over and over and over. He would start a ministry, it would flourish, the Jews would get jealous, they would attack him. He would go to another city, hundreds of miles away. They didn't have cars, they walked by foot, so it's a long ways away, like me walking to Idaho or something. Start another ministry. The Jews there would reject it, other Jews would come in, it would flourish, the Gentiles would start to get saved, and then he would get attacked. He'd have to flee, and have to flee, and have to flee. Now, he's just told the Jews, hey, you're blood, you're rejecting it, I'm going to the Gentiles. Now people are starting to get saved, and he's probably scared. Because he's seen this pattern over and over and over again. Man, as soon as God does the work, I'm going to get attacked, my life's going to be threatened. This is what I've seen the whole time. Now, God doesn't waste his words. It'd be foolish of me to say, hey, Brent, don't be scared if you're not scared. right? It's like a waste of words. But if you're terrified, listen, don't be afraid. God's got this. So God doesn't speak unless someone's afraid. And so for the Lord to say, hey, don't be afraid, tells me that Paul was afraid. He's seen the pattern. He's like, oh, I'm gonna have to flee again. I don't know what to do. Maybe I'm gonna go out by night. And God speaks to him. Maybe while he's packing his bags at night. I'm gonna flee under the cover of night again. And the Lord's like, listen, don't be afraid. Stay. No one, yes, you're gonna get attacked verbally, but no one's gonna physically hurt you. I have many people in the city. And I love that I have many people in the city because those people don't know the gospel yet. So what God is telling Paul is, listen, there are people who are going to come to me. I have many people who are going to come to me in the city. Stay. Keep teaching. Keep preaching. Okay? Now, what's interesting here is that Paul, apart from Corinth is the place that Paul stayed the longest. Ephesus is actually the longest. Paul stayed in Corinth for about 1.5 years, 2 years. He'll be in Ephesus for 3 years. So he's in here a long period of time. In fact, he says in verse 12, Acts 18:12, when Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat. Okay, so the Lord speaks to him and says, don't be afraid. Paul stays 1.5 years. 1.5 years later of him ministering to the Gentiles, the Jews start to do something here. And they start to get riled up, and now they're going to drag Paul and take him to the governor of, he's on the island of, like the land of Achaia. That was like, he's in Oregon. And they dragged him from Corinth, to like, so it'd be like here, Beaverton, dragging us to Salem, and putting us right before the main guy to go to court. And that's what they're doing. So they drag him there. Gallio is the ruler, the governor there. Now, I want you to notice that in our text before, in verses 9 through 11, God didn't tell Paul to stay indefinitely. He said, stay, you're going to be fine. So Paul stays 1.5 years. Okay, so Gallio, the governor of Achaia, they bring it to him, and it says in Acts 18:13-14, going on in the story, they bring him to the governor, and it says, they say to the governor, this fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. And when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, so Paul's about to make his defense, right? And he doesn't have to. And I love this. Did you know that sometimes you don't need to open your mouth for God to defend you? Did you know that? See, we have the open mouth insert foot ministry in our church, right? We like to just spew things out in our defense. I'm guilty of this myself. But I remember I went through a huge trial a couple years ago. And God spoke to me from Psalm 62, verse 6. And I was at my doctor. And my doctor doesn't know what's going on in my life, my trial. And my doctor's like, man, I was at the beach. My doctor's just sharing this with me. I was at the beach, and I saw this rock. And on this rock, it had PS 62:6. And I don't know, you're a Christian, maybe it's for you. And so I look it up, and Psalm 62:6 says this. It says, he only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be moved. And I was like, Lord, you're so clever. I don't have to open my mouth. Like, you got me. And he did. He got me through this huge trial in my life. I didn't have to open my mouth. And so Paul doesn't have to open his mouth. The Lord defends him. Okay? Now, what's interesting is Paul's going to work through an unsaved political Roman governor, official, to deliver Paul from this. It's actually pretty powerful. Now, on a side note, okay, we know that the book of Luke and the book of Acts are both written by the author named Luke. And they're both written to this guy named Theophilus. If you read like the first couple of verses in Luke chapter 1, he says, oh, Theophilus, and Luke starts to write from the time of the genealogy of Jesus all the way to his death and resurrection. And he's writing on a scroll, and he runs out of space. He sends that off. And then Acts, he starts off at, Theophilus, remember the former thing I wrote the book of Luke? Here's the other half of it, and it goes from the time of Jesus' resurrection to the first 30 years of the church. And I believe that the book of Luke and the book of Acts, the primary thing, the reason why Luke wrote it was to defend Paul, because Paul was in Rome, in prison, because he was in prison for being a Christian. And in Roman culture, it's illegal to have a new religion without getting it legalized by the Roman thing. And so what Luke is doing, especially in the book of Luke, he's showing, listen, it's not a new religion. He shows that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Judaism. He's the fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures. That's what Luke shows. And then he moves on to show that Paul, he's defending Paul in the book of Acts. Now it's interesting, in the book of Acts, whenever Luke will talk about a Roman official, there's two things that he does that's kind of unique that you'll see here. He never talks in a negative light against a Roman official, which makes sense. If he's writing a defense for Paul to send to Rome, to the prosecuting attorneys, he's not going to speak negatively of the governors. But he also shows that all of the people, whenever Paul is before a governor, that all those governors declare Paul innocent. And that's what he's doing here. That this governor, the governor of the region of Corinth, of Achaia, has declared Paul innocent. And I love how he uses the phrases here, which we'll see here. Okay? Because he's going to show that Gallio is linking Christianity into Judaism, that he sees it as the same thing. Watch this. Verse 14, Acts 18:14. Gallio says, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason why I should bear with you. But if it is a question of words and names and your own law, your own religion, look into it yourselves, for I do not want to be a judge of such matters. And he drove them from the judgment seat, from the courtroom. He says, get out of my courts. I don't want to hear this garbage. This is your religion. I don't even want to know about it. I don't want to deal with it. So he's validating Paul here. And he lumps in Christianity with Judaism, which is really cool. I'm saying it's right. Now, it's important, again, because of that Roman law there. So he kicks him out of the court. And then the Greeks take this leader of the synagogue. Remember, Crispus has been removed. He's a Christian now. There's a new leader of the synagogue named. His name is Sosthenes. Sosthenes. That's how it's pronounced. I had to do my little hooked on phonics here. Sosthenes. And it says in verse 17, then all the Greeks took Sosthenes. I'm just going to call him SOS because he's going to need an SOS right here. The ruler of the synagogue, and they beat him before the judgment seat. But Gallio, the governor, took no notice of such things. You want to talk about a turn of events? Okay? You want to talk about God being your defense? The Jews are out to persecute Paul, and the next thing you know, they're being persecuted themselves. Here's another interesting fact, and this trips me out. Mr. SOS, Sosthenes, actually gets saved later on. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, Paul says this. He says, Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God, and Sosthenes, this dude, SOS, our brother, to the church of God which is at Corinth. So this other Jewish religious leader gets saved. Do you know what that means? That means these Greeks literally beat the hell out of him when they beat him here. Like literally, right? That'd be a rough way to hear the gospel. This guy was broken literally, you know? And he eventually gets saved. This real Gallio doesn't even blink an eye, okay? He ignores it. He says, this is your problem, deal with it. And then he says in Acts 18:18. Remember, we're going to 23. We're almost done. So Paul still remained a good while. Then, so he's there. He's a year and a half. They drag him in there. He stays a little bit longer, probably a couple more months. And then it says, and then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria. And Priscilla and Aquila, those are the husband and wife, were with him. He had cut his hair off at Centuria, for he had taken a vow. Now I have another slide here of Centuria. So Corinth is, you can see that I circled Centuria. So he just goes from one side of the canal there, he goes to the other side because he's about to sail back home, kind of thing. So he's in Centuria, which is another port city. I have another slide, slide 18 here. Okay, so you have Corinth down in the bottom middle left. He's going to sail from Centuria. He's going to go to Ephesus. He's going to go from Ephesus. You can follow these arrows. He's going to go all the way to Caesarea. He's going to go down to Jerusalem, or they say up to Jerusalem. And then from Jerusalem, he's going to go back up to Antioch of Syria, which is his home church where he started his missionary journey at. So now he's going to start heading back from his second missionary journey. Okay? But he leaves Corinth and he goes to Centuria, and then, again, he'll end up in Caesarea, Jerusalem, Antioch. Okay? But notice that Paul cuts off his hair in Centuria. Okay? Which tells me that Paul had taken some kind of Nazirite vow when he was in Corinth. Okay? Now, when you take a Nazirite vow, what happens is you don't cut your hair. You cut your hair at the end of the Nazirite vow. And when you do a Nazirite vow, what you're really doing is you're not drinking wine. You're kind of separating yourself, and for the work of God. And it makes sense that Paul, he's being dragged into the thing. He probably takes this Nazirite vow because he's been there for a while. He's probably seeking the Lord, like, well, okay, I'm going to set myself apart, Lord, and I'm going to seek you about what I'm to do next. And so he takes his vow, he hears from the Lord, he realizes he needs to go back home to his church in Antioch of Syria. So he's going to go by Ephesus because he wants to do work there. He's going to go down to Caesarea, which is the port city to go to Jerusalem. He's going to go up to Jerusalem for the feast. He's going to meet with the leaders there, and then he's going to go back home. And so it's just interesting to me that this is what happens. Okay? So Paul ends his vow. Now when he goes to Ephesus, he takes Aquila and Priscilla and he leaves them in Ephesus, which is going to be important because he's going to do his longest length of work in Ephesus. He's going to spend 3 years there. So he leaves Aquila and Priscilla there. And then we'll wrap it up here. He says in Acts 18 verses 19 through 22, and he came to Ephesus and left them there, Aquila and Priscilla. But he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay a longer time with them, he did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep the coming feast in Jerusalem. But I will return to you again, God willing. And he sailed from Ephesus, and when he had landed in Caesarea and gone up and greeted the church, this is in Jerusalem, then he went down to Antioch. Okay? So Paul wanted to go to Ephesus this whole time. This whole time when he was on his first missionary journey, that's where he wanted to go. That's where he wanted to do the work. Because Ephesus is the hub of the Roman Empire. And so he ends up going there, dropping off part of his team, and he goes back. Interesting, Aquila and Priscilla are mentioned in Romans chapter 16 because they end up going back to Rome, which is where Paul's going to end up going later. So it's really cool to tie all these pieces together. And then he closes the verse 23, and he says, after he spent some time there, this is in Antioch of Syria, his home church, he departed and went over the region of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. So he goes back to his previous churches that he planted, and then he's going to end up going into Ephesus. And in Acts chapter 19, he's going to spend 3 years in Ephesus. Okay? So Paul, this is the last thing I want to highlight, and then we'll wrap it, is Paul is on this missionary journey for years. He starts in Antioch of Syria, he does all of this stuff, and then he ends up going back to his home church. And this is really, really important, because you go back to your home church, why? To be refreshed, to be refilled, to receive, because you've been giving all this time, giving. Now he's having a time of refreshment, giving them updates, sharing. He's got insight about what God's doing in the Gentile world that they have no idea about. So he's going to say, listen, God's all-inclusive. He's poured out His Spirit in this city, in this city, in this city. We've got churches all over now, and he's sharing that information, which tells me this. Missionaries have a perspective that you and I don't have. And if you can sit down and talk with someone who's been in the mission field, it will open up your eyes to what God is doing around the globe in a bigger and more powerful way. Okay? Because they have so much to offer us and to teach us and to show us that, listen, God is all-inclusive. He's reaching every community on the planet. Because sometimes we can get isolated in our bubble. And so it's really, really important. Okay? So, church ministry is hard. It's difficult. It's challenging. And if we work hard in the world, shouldn't we work harder when we're serving the Lord in the church? Let us always be a church that's known for our hard work in serving the Lord. Let it never be an afterthought. Do you receive that? All right, let's pray.